Rendova Island. 4 July 1943. The stink hit you first. It always did on Rendova. A wet, green, living stench that crawled inside your nose and set up house. Rotting palm fronds, human waste from 1,000 foxholes, diesel oil, coral dust, and the sweet heavy reek of bodies that had been lying in the sun too long after the last raid. On the morning of 4 July 1943, that smell was mixed with something worse, the ghost of burning gasoline and roasted flesh that still drifted across the beach from 2 days earlier. Private First Class Evan Evans tasted it every time he breathed. He had been tasting it for 3 solid weeks. 22 years old, 5'10", 148 pounds soaking wet. Evans looked like any other Midwestern farm boy who had traded overalls for dungarees. Brown hair, already thinning from the salt and the malaria pills, freckles burned dark across his nose, hazel eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. He knelt now in the No. 3 gun pit of Battery C, 9th Defense Battalion, United States Marine Corps, knees sunk deep in warm coral mud that sucked greedily at his boondockers. The mud was the color of coffee with milk, and it never dried. It only got deeper. Above him, the long barrel of the 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun pointed northwest, up the slot, toward Rabaul, 550 miles away. 9 tons of steel and hydraulics, painted the same dull olive that everything in the Pacific seemed to turn the moment it left the factory. The paint was already blistering off the barrel from yesterday's test firing. The breech still smelled of fresh cosmoline and the sharp bite of new cordite. Around the pit, the rest of the crew moved like parts of a single machine. Private Roy E. Boone, Indianapolis, 19, loader. Tall, raw-boned, always humming hymn tunes under his breath, even when the shells were slamming home. Private First Class John S. Gamborowski, Saginaw, Michigan, 20, Fewsetter and General Wiseass. Polished cheekbones, black hair, cigarette perpetually glued to his lower lip, even though the lieutenant had threatened to court-martial the next man who lit up in the gun pit. Corporal Luis Chico Ramirez Rammer, from San Antonio. Quiet, quick hands. The only man in the crew who never swore in English. Sergeant Tom McAllister, gun captain, 31, regular Marine. Tarawa, still 2 years in his future, but already looking like he had seen the elephant, and didn't much care for it. They had been together since Camp Lejeune. They knew one another's heartbeat. 2 nights earlier, on 2 July, 16 Betty bombers had come in low and fast, while the SCR-268 radars were still blind from an earlier raid. No warning. The first string of bombs walked straight across the beach. Fuel dump, ammunition dump, field hospital. Evans had watched a 500-pound bomb detonate directly on the surgical tent. Men who had survived Guadalcanal were turned into red steam and flying boots. 59 dead before the smoke cleared, 77 wounded. The sand itself had caught fire and burned for 6 hours. Evans and every other man in the 9th Defense Battalion had stood at their guns that day and fired 32 rounds apiece into empty sky. The Bettys were gone before the first shell reached altitude. The only thing the guns had killed was the morning Kong. That night, Lieutenant Colonel William H. Scheer, CO of the 9th, walked the gun line with a flashlight and a bottle of medicinal brandy nobody was supposed to know about. He didn't shout. He just looked each crew in the eye and said, "Next time they come, we will be ready. Because if we're not, there won't be anybody left to dig graves." Then, the rain came down in sheets for 36 straight hours. Biblical rain, the kind that turned every path into a creek and every foxhole into a swimming pool. But rain was also cover. While the rest of the island huddled under ponchos and cursed the weather, the radar mechanics worked. They cannibalized 2 wrecked SCR-268 sets, stripped parts from a third that belonged to the Army across the channel, bribed a Navy chief with a case of bourbon, and by 0400 on 4 July, the radars were breathing again. Not perfect, not factory new, but the scopes glowed green, and the antennas turned, and the operators could see 150 miles up the slot. That was all that mattered. Dawn came gray and wet. The clouds hung so low you could almost touch them. Visibility, maybe 4 miles. Broken. Perfect bombing weather. Evans was cleaning the breach when the first call came. Radar contact. Many bogeys, 120 miles northwest. Angels, 1 to 4,000. Speed 220. Track 320. They're coming right down the slot. The voice belonged to Corporal Andy Kowalski, radar operator. Brooklyn accent thick enough to spread on rye bread. Evans felt his stomach drop straight through the coral. He spat the taste of last night's Spam and cold coffee, wiped his mouth with the back of a hand already black with powder residue, and looked at Sergeant McAllister. McAllister's eyes were flat, calm. "You heard the man. Load VT frag. High explosive shells with variable time fuses. The new secret fuses that didn't need to touch the airplane only get close. The fuses the States had been shipping across the Pacific in crates marked radios handle with care." The crew moved like they had done it in their sleep for years. because Boone and another loader muscled the first 24-pound shell out of the ready rack. The projectile was the length of a man's arm, olive drab with a yellow band and the stenciled letters VT stenciled just below the fuse cap. Gamborowski spun the fuse setter to the number the director was calling out, 18.4 seconds to climb to 10,000 feet. Ramirez waited with the rammer tray. McAllister stood behind the elevation and traverse handwheels, eyes on the pointer needles that danced as the Sperry M4 director downstairs tried to marry radar data to mechanical prediction for the first time in combat. On the way, McAllister barked. Evans settled his elbows into the padded shoulder rests, cheek against the rubber pad, eyes jammed into the sight. The world shrank to a circle of cloud, and the faint, distant drone that was growing louder every second. The air raid siren on the beach began its long, rising scream. Men scattered like ants. Landing craft reversed engines and backed away from the pier. A jeep full of Seabees rolled straight into a bomb crater and stalled. Somewhere, a cook was still trying to save the breakfast coffee, cursing in fluent Cajun. Then the guns opened. Battery A, first 4 muffled thuds from the far end of the line. Then Battery B, then Battery C, Gun 3, right in Evans' lap. The 90mm M1 fired with a sound that was not a sound at all, more like a physical blow to the whole body. The muzzle flash was a white sun. The recoil slammed the 9-ton mount backward until the spade bit deep into the coral and the whole pit jumped 6 inches. A hurricane of blast pressure flattened everything within 30 yards. Empty casings shot out of the ejector like brass cannonballs, ringing off the shield, bouncing across the steel deck plates, hissing where they landed in puddles. Evans tasted blood. The concussion had burst a capillary in his nose. "Loaded!" Boone yelled, voice already hoarse. "Set." Gamborowski. "Fire." Again and again. 3 seconds per round, 28 rounds per minute, theoretical maximum. They were doing 25, and the barrel was already turning the color of a ripe cherry. The sky began to fill with black cotton balls. At 20 miles, the first shell bursts appeared, ugly bruises against the pale morning. The Japanese formation flew straight through them, disciplined, unafraid. Tiny silver crosses that grew larger with every heartbeat. Evans could hear them now, the unsynchronized drone of twin Kasei engines, a rippling growl that rose and fell like a huge, angry cat. 15 miles. The director downstairs was singing. The radar return was clean, strong. The M4 computer, never designed to drink straight from a radar set, was somehow keeping up. Pointer needles danced, matched, steadied. Match pointers. Steady. Steady. Fire. Evans squeezed both triggers. 18 seconds later, at 10,000 feet above Blanche Channel, a 24-pound shell full of Comp B detonated 30 meters in front of the lead Betty. The burst was a black rose blooming in the sky. Shrapnel, thousands of jagged steel cubes slashed through aluminum and fabric and flesh. The Betty's right engine disintegrated in a shower of burning magnesium. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire raced back along the wing route. The bomber rolled slowly onto its back, trailing a solid rope of black smoke and orange flame, and began the long fall. It hit the water 4 miles offshore with a sound like the end of the world. A white column shot 200 feet into the air, hung for a second, then collapsed, leaving only burning gasoline spreading across the waves. Evans didn't cheer. There was no time. The sky had become a slaughterhouse. Shellbursts walked up and down the Japanese formation. Another Betty took a direct hit in the bomb bay. Secondary explosions ripped it into 3 pieces before it fell. A third lost its entire tail to a near miss and went into a flat spin, engine screaming higher and higher until it smashed into the jungle on New Georgia in an orange-white flash that lit the treetops like a second sun. 6 miles out, the Japanese commander lost his nerve. Bomb bay doors on the remaining bombers yawned open, and 500-pound bombs rained down in strings. They hit empty ocean, throwing up towering white geysers that drenched the gun pits with warm saltwater rain. The Bettys broke formation, some climbing, some diving, some turning hard for home. They never made it. The 90mm guns hunted like wolves. A lone Betty tried to sneak west low over the water, wave hopping at 50 feet. Battery E walked 3 shells into it. The third detonated directly beneath the fuselage. The bomber simply ceased to exist, replaced by a boiling sphere of orange fire and black smoke that left only burning scraps skipping across the sea. Another pair climbed hard for altitude, engines howling, trying to get above the shell ceiling. Evans tracked the leader. The barrel of Gun 3 was glowing dull red now. Heat waves made the sight picture dance. He fired twice in 4 seconds. The second shell burst just below the Betty's belly. The concussion lifted the whole aircraft 20 feet. When it dropped back, the fuselage was folded in half like a cheap knife. It fell in a flat spin, engines still screaming, and hit the side of a hill on New Georgia in a fireball that rolled uphill through the trees. The air stank of kerosene, scorched aluminum, cordite, and something sweeter burning meat carried on the wind from a bomber that had burned all the way down with its crew trapped inside. One, Betty, detonated in midair when its own bombs cooked off in the bay. The explosion was so violent it rattled teeth in Evans' head 3 miles away. By 0932, the sky was almost empty. 12 burning wrecks ringed the horizon. Oil slicks spread across the channel like black lily pads. Pieces of wing, tail, engine, cowling bobbed in the swell. Here and there, a parachute drifted down, silk blooming white against the smoke, but no one was watching to see if the pilots made it to the water alive. The last 4 Bettys were limping northwest, trailing smoke and fuel, climbing for altitude they would never reach. Evans tracked the rearmost one out to 12 miles, fired one last ranging shot that burst 300 meters behind it just to remind them that Rendova could still reach out and touch. Then silence. Real silence. The kind that presses on your eardrums after an hour of continuous thunder. The gun barrel glowed orange. Paint had blistered off in long curls. Steam rose where raindrops touched metal. Empty casings lay 3 deep around the mount, some still ticking as they cooled. The coral sand in the pit was glazed black in a perfect circle around the spade. Evans stepped back from the sight. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't close them. Cordite stung his eyes until they streamed. His ears rang with a high, metallic whine that swallowed every other sound. Salt water and sweat poured down his face, cutting pale channels through the powder residue caked on his cheeks. Someone handed him a canteen. He drank and tasted blood and brass. Over the field, telephone came Lieutenant Cole. Shire's voice, hoarse but steady. Cease fire. Good shooting, Marines. Damn good shooting. The numbers came in slowly. 16 Gneliam bombers had attacked. 12 confirmed destroyed. 4 escaped, trailing smoke and fire, almost certainly to ditch somewhere in the Solomon Sea before reaching Rabaul. Total rounds expended by the 12 90mm guns of the 9th Defense Battalion, 488. American casualties from the raid, 0. Japanese bombs that hit Rendova, 0. In 27 minutes, the 9th Defense Battalion had achieved the single most devastating anti-aircraft victory of the Pacific War. The Japanese never mounted another serious daylight raid on Rendova. With the beachhead secure, the 155mm long toms across the channel pounded Munda airfield into surrender 5 weeks ahead of schedule. The Central Solomons campaign ended early. The road to Rabaul cracked open. All because, on one hot, wet, stinking Independence Day morning in 1943, 12 big guns, and the Marines who served them proved that radar plus nerve plus 90mm high explosive could turn Suicide Point into the graveyard of Japanese naval aviation. Evan Evans went on to Guam, rose to sergeant, came home in 1946, became a machinist, married, raised children, spoke of that morning only when the nightmares woke him, shaking and soaked in sweat. Roy Boone died in 1998, John Gambarowski in 2006, but the photograph taken that afternoon still exists in the National Archives. 3 young Marines standing beside a scorched, glowing 90mm barrel, grinning like they had just won the World Series. The caption reads simply, "This is one of the anti-aircraft guns which wiped out a Japanese bomber fleet of 12 planes in a single day at Rendova Island. They never asked for medals. They never got any. They just changed the mathematics of the Pacific War in 27 minutes of fire and steel and cordite stink, then went back to cleaning their gun because the Japanese always came back. Only after 4 July 1943, they came back a lot less often. And when they did, they flew higher, at night. And they were afraid. Semper Fi."